Welcome. If you were on yesterday, I hope day 2 of Lent is going well for you. I'm enjoying so far the process that us guys are doing of going through that Romans 12 and just kind of meditating on those verses. It's good stuff to spend extra time on. I don't know if I've ever actually done that before, where you take like a whole week to spend a week meditating on one verse. Meditating, like just chewing on it, really thinking about it and bringing it back to memory again and again. It's just something I've never done, and it's been kind of good because it's kind of really making it sink in. We need this stuff to sink in. Amen? So, we've got verse 26 of Acts 21. He's got those guys. He's going to go to the temple to show that he's still a Jewish Jew. And so here's Paul. It says, Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people the law in this place. And furthermore, he also brings Greeks into the temple and has defiled the holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed. Then all the people ran together. They seized Paul. They dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. And some among the multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded that it be taken to the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of people followed after crying out, Away with him. So, 10 verses. And we may just keep going here in a second. But what was going on, okay? So we have the temple. And if you get a chance to maybe look at a picture of the temple, it would be helpful. But you have the Temple Mount. So today you can go up on the Temple Mount, and there's no other walls that belong to the Jewish temple. But the idea was that there was the outermost court. This was called the court of the Gentiles. Now, anyone could go to that outer court. A lot of Jesus' teachings were in that outer court because you would hear of, there'd be other people in that area. But Jesus would go in further from there too, not to say that was, that was exclusively where he was. And then between that court and the next court inward, it got more exclusive as you went in. It was called the court of the women. Why? Well, if you went inward, you had to be Jewish. And so the next court beyond that was called the court of the men, because only a man, a Jewish man who had gone through a bar mitzvah, was allowed into that next court. So prior to that was all the women and children and men and everyone else too. The idea was, though, is that you just had to be Jewish. In between those 2 courts, the court of the Gentiles and the court of the women, where you had to be Jewish to enter, there was just a small retaining wall. It wasn't a big wall that would block your view, but it was definitely a wall you couldn't get over. And on that wall was a warning that if you passed through that wall and you were not Jewish, it was a death penalty. Ephesians 2:14, For he himself is our peace, speaking of Jesus, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation. That's what it's being talked about in Ephesians chapter 2, is that wall through Christ was broken down. It's no longer Jew and Gentile. It's all of us. We all can come to Christ, and we don't have to be Jewish. And so that is what they thought had happened. They believed, they saw this guy, Trophimus the Ephesian, with Paul, and so they assumed that Paul had brought a non Jew past the wall. So everyone begins to be in an uproar. They're going to stone him. And we see the centurion, the captain, he comes out. He kind of saves the day for Paul, gets Paul. He couldn't figure out what's going on because everyone's in just such a rage. So he gets Paul out of there. Now, verse 37, it says, then as Paul was led to be led to the barracks, he said to the commander, may I speak to you? He replied, can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led 4,000 assassins into the wilderness? But Paul said, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people. So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. So, I'll just mention history. I guess we're getting our history in today. He speaks about this Egyptian who stirred up a rebellion, and there was 4,000 assassins that went off into the wilderness. This is the word, the sikarim, and we talked about this at church actually just a couple of weeks ago about how Barabbas was likely a member of the Zealots and even possibly one of the Sicarii, who are these cloak and dagger. They would have a dagger in their cloak, right? And they were assassins, and they'd sneak into a crowd and they would kill people. And here, that word assassins in verse 38, it's the sikarim. It's the, M at the end is the plural. And so this is this group of guys that were assassins. And the zealots, they were the group that they wanted Rome gone. And they would kill Romans and they would kill Jews if it would stir up the Jews to overthrow Rome. They didn't care who they killed as long as at the end of the day, they were getting rid of all of the Romans in their area. So that's what's going on there. So Paul goes and he begins to do his speech. And his speech, it's going to take us some time. I don't think we're able to get into all of 22 today. But in verse 1 of chapter 22, it does say, brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. He gives this defense. He does it in Hebrew, the language they understand, though the Roman centurion would not understand it, as it seems, because he'll have to ask for clarification later because he couldn't understand the Hebrew. But Paul says, here's my defense. In the Greek, that's the word apologia. It's where, if you've read Socrates, which I just wrote about my favorite teacher from senior year of high school, just before I got on here, and I read Socrates and whatnot in his class. I remember from his class, and the apology. It wasn't an apology. The apology is when Socrates defends himself in court. It's that word defense. It's the word we have from 1 Peter 3:15 that says that we ought to always be ready to give a defense to those who ask. And the idea is that we as Christians have a responsibility, not just pastors, not just these guys or those guys. I don't know. I remember in years past having friends and they're just kind of like, well, I'm not one of those kinds of Christians. And I've always just struggled to say, well, friend, there's really only one kind of Christian, like the obedient kind. There's no Christians that God has called to just meander. Now, you can be a Christian and meander. You can be saved and never be obedient, right? Obedience doesn't make my kids, right? I got a bunch of kids, and obedience isn't part of the equation as to whether or not they're my children, but it definitely has a whole lot to do with us being on good terms. And so being a Christian and being an obedient Christian are two totally different things. And so when people say, well, I'm not that kind of Christian, what they're saying is I'm not the obedient kind. And part of obedience is where Paul's going to give a defense here. And it just reminded me that word, apologia, in that command in 1 Peter 3:15. where we are all called to be able to give a defense. This ties back in just a few mornings ago where I talked about in 2 Timothy 2:24, where it says, all servants, everyone who wants to serve the Lord, should be able to teach. And so this is why we get together every morning. We're going through the Bible, trying to understand it better so that you all can be obedient, so that you're ready to give a defense, so that you're able to teach, so that you guys are able to explain things, because it talks about in 1 Peter 3:15 that there's people who want to know about the hope that you have. They want to know about the faith that you believe, and we need to be able to give them answers. And I think one of the things that truly pushes so many people away from Christianity is we talk about a God who changes lives, and a God who can transform, and a God who can provide, and a God who can protect. And then so many of us really can't explain anything about him. Oh, come, you need to find out about this guy, this God whom I love. Well, can you explain these things about him? Well, no. I don't really know that much about him. I just know it's really exciting. And that can get discouraging for people who are on the outside looking in. And so this is why the Bible has these commands, and these commands are for all Christians, that we all should be able to teach people the simple basic truths about the Bible. Not everyone's going to be a Bible teacher and have random junk like I have memorized. That's, I have a specific calling. But we all are called to be able to teach the basics of the Bible. And we're all called to be able to give a defense. We're not all going to be apologetic, professors. We're not all going to be, these guys who are what they do is defend the faith. Apologists, that's what they do. But we're all called to be able to give those basic defenses, those basic answers when we're called out, when people, bring it to the table. And actually, we did apologetics with our church, and we had some great tricks and tips on how to defend the faith without knowing everything, and just being ready and being prepared. Quite often when people make these accusations against Christianity, like, oh, the Bible's full of contradictions and all that kind of stuff, one of the best responses is just putting it back on them and being like, can you give me an example of a contradiction? At which point they have nothing to say. But you were ready. You had a response. You were prepared to give a defense like Paul is about to give. He's going to defend his actions. He's going to defend his faith. He's going to defend the gospel. And so we're all called to defend. Yes, or just memorize all of the early church fathers' writings. In fact, Enrique, I will do it if you want to buy me the book set. I was looking at an early church father commentary. They only wanted $800 for the used set. It's pretty, I'd have to back up to kind of show you how big the book set would be, but it looks really cool. Anyway, but yeah, be ready, be prepared to give a defense. Now you know about the wall of division, the retaining, that wall that divides. You know about the Sakari, which I don't know how that ever come up in a conversation, but as we do this day by day, little by little, we feed ourselves the word of God, and we are preparing ourselves to be used by God and to walk in obedience so that we can truly experience the blessings of God. So there you go. God bless you guys. I hope you join me tomorrow morning at 7:30 as we dig in even further and we hear Paul kind of give his testimony and give his defense. We should probably move through that whole section tomorrow. So love you guys. Have a great day. Adios.